See discussions, stats, and author profiles for this publication at https://www.researchgate.net/publication/349772775 Panentheism and the Problem of World Inclusion, A Category Theoretic Approach Preprint March 2021 Citations 02 Authors, including Jonathan Mize University of North Texas 17 publications 2 citations See profile reads 449 Some of the authors of this publication are also working on these related projects. Philosophy of Mathematics View Project Cross-Analyzing Wittgenstein's Tractatus and Langen's CTMU View Project All content following this page was uploaded by Jonathan Mize on March 10, 2021. The user has requested enhancement of the downloaded file. Panentheism and the Problem of World Inclusion, A Category Theoretic Approach Jonathan J. Mize1 and Vincent Geil Enberg 2 Abstract Panentheism is a theism with great potential. Whereas pantheism takes God to be equivalent to the world, panentheism entertains as much while still asserting God's transcendence of the mere world. There is much beauty in this idea that God is both in the world and above it. But there is also much subtlety and confusion. Panentheism is notoriously tricky to demarcate from the other theisms, and there is plenty of nuance left to be explored. The core problem of panentheism is this: what exactly does it mean for the world to include God and for God to contain the world? Numerous answers have been given, but it seems there is still something left to be desired. In this paper, we endeavor to give panentheism a firm and rigorous footing. Utilizing basic category theory, we provide a precise answer to the daunting problem of world inclusion. In the process, we also offer a new variety of metaphysical grounding, morphic grounding. Keywords: panentheism, world inclusion, grounding, demarcation, problem, category theory. Panentheism has become a sort of fad. In the words of theologian Oliver D. Crisp III, all the cool kids want to be panentheists. And this may indeed be the case. There is a certain seduction to the panentheistic worldview. Panentheism can be seen as a sort of extension of so-called classical theism. This view allows those who admire God's transcendence yet feel dismayed by the chasm between God and world to have their cake and eat it too. At the same time, as is the case with many fads, panentheism is vilified, and its advocates seem perpetually on the defensive. Panentheism has struggled to prove its worth, and many philosophers of religion fail to see how the notion can be defined in any rigorous sense. This struggle of definition is known loosely as the demarcation problem of panentheism. On the extreme, scholars dismiss the notion in its entirety. Benedict Paul Gope denies that panentheism has any conceptual unity whatsoever. In his There Is No Panentheistic Paradigm, 2015, and if there is not outright denial of the conceptual validity of the notion, there is still lingering skepticism. R. T. Mullins ends a recent paper of his with a brazen address to panentheists, 1 Philosophy and Religion, University of North Texas. Email, Jonathan Mize at my.unt.edu 2 Research Fellow, Zeppelin Universitat, Friedrichshafen. Email, Vincent.G. at zu.de 3 Crisp, 2019, if they reject my proposal, I am left to ask once again, is panentheism actually a position at all? Perhaps it is, but I shall leave it to the panentheists to explain how this is the case, for assuredly, many talented and ambitious scholars have answered Mullins's call. George Gasser provides a marvelous defense of the validity of panentheism by enumerating the potential meanings of the N in panentheism, just as Michael Stenmark gives a stellar overview of panentheism in relation to its neighbors in Theism. 5 Despite these valiant efforts, we contend that the notion of panentheism is still quite diffuse, aching for a rigorous conceptual unification. But what does such conceptual unification even mean? And what would such a thing look like? We wish to provide a precise definition for the following relationships: 1. The world is in God, and 2. God is in the world. Moreover, after we have addressed these problems, we must consider the relationship between them. Thus, we will also require a definition for the following: 3. How can God be both in the world and have the world in himself? Drawing motivation from Gasser's insistence that the divine omnipresence exhibited in panentheism is best considered in terms of God's capacity of action, we will utilize a tool which emphasizes dynamic relationship over static collection category theory. Point 6. In surveying the field we will examine several different definitions of panentheism. Then, in distilling panentheism, we will winnow down the notion to what we believe to be its core characteristics. Finally, in a category theoretic definition of panentheism we will present our proposed conceptual unification of the notion. Surveying the field, many definitions of panentheism are rather vague. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy defines panentheism as a notion taking God and the world to be interrelated, with the world being in God and God being in the world. 7. Philip Clayton states, panentheism is the claim that the world exists within the divine, although God is also more than the world. 8. The term is Greek, a composite of pan, meaning all, en, meaning in, and theos meaning God. Of course, the crucial question is, what exactly does this in mean? There are myriad panentheisms, and perhaps the greatest source of division amongst them is the abundance of interpretations of what the en means. It seems we could say this: there are just as many conceptions of the in as there are different varieties of panentheism. Theologian Tom Ord delineates a few of the various readings of the en in panentheism. There are such standpoints as, the world is in God because that is its literal location, God encompasses or contains the world, and God provides the ground for emergences in, or the emergence of, the world. There are also such views as, all things are contained in Christ, God ensouls the world, and God energizes the world. 9. Although we believe the basic panentheistic question is simple enough, we would be remiss as scholars to omit discussion of the wider field of panentheism. 4. Mullins, 2016, 5. Panentheism and Its Neighbors, International Journal for Philosophy of Religion, 2019, 85:2341. 6. God's Omnipresence in the World, On Possible Meanings of En in Panentheism, International Journal for Philosophy of Religion, 2019, 85:4362. 7. https://plato.stanford.edu/entries/panentheism/8 Clayton, 2017, 9 C. Peacock and Clayton, 2004. The variety. We have already briefly discussed the various interpretations of the in panentheism. But there is an entire conceptual and cultural smorgasbord of panentheism left to devour. Although the term itself has only been used for several hundred years, its introduction by the German philosopher Karl C. F. Kraus in the 18th century, the concept behind it has been alive for millennia. The late Charles Hartshorne traced the concept back to writings of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten in 14th century B.C. Point 10. On the topic of dipolarity, the idea that God embodies various contradictory characteristics, Hartshorne even found traces of panentheism in Plato's ideas of the forms and the world soul. Point 11. More well known, several varieties of Hinduism ascribe panentheistic properties to Brahman. Raphael Ladaster and Purushottama Bilimoria tell us, Brahman is reality, all that exists is incorporated into it. Brahman is often considered to be indistinguishable from the natural world, leading some Hindus to assert Aha Brahmsmi, I am Brahman. 12. Despite the great cultural diversity of the concept, panentheism is tightly coupled, in modern philosophy of religion, with the Christian worldview. And, whether or not Christ or the Trinity is explicitly mentioned, monotheism and its core characteristics are used as axioms. Michael Stenmark claims that the distinguishing feature of monotheism is something called minimal personal theism or MPT. MPT, God is conscious or mind-like, or personal, or person-like, or has properties at least similar to those of a person. Point 13. Stenmark claims that this minimal condition is common to all monotheisms, even deism. In addition, Stenmark offers several more conditions for a healthy, non-deistic monotheism, from 1. God is the creator of the world, so the world depends on God for its origin, and 2. God could exist without this world or without any other world, so God in no way depends on the world for God's own existence. 2. 3. The continuing existence of the world depends on God's ongoing creative activity. We will say this: whatever variety abounds in Western panentheism, at the very least, all particular breeds hold true to each of these conditions. All the same, the above conditions merely tell us what panentheism is not. There is a profusion of scholars wishing to tell us what panentheism is. George Gasser gives a wonderful overview of the numerous proposed meanings of the N in panentheism. 14 He introduces four of the most common interpretations of the inclusion relationship between God and the objects of the world, or what he calls God-world interrelatedness. That of ubiquitous extension, one of space as divine attribute, one of immaterial extension in space, and that of divine agency. We will now introduce Gasser's project and offer a brief overview of each of these interpretations. 10 Walker Jr. and Wickramasinghe, 2015, 11 https://plato.stanford.edu/entries/panentheism/12 Laudister and Billy Moria, 2018, 13 Stenmark, 2019, 14 Gasser, 2019. Gasser starts with the recognition that the concept of divine omnipresence is crucial in explicating panentheism. Of course, this notion is not exclusive to panentheism. Divine omnipresence factors into all monotheisms, save deism. Gasser addresses this by pointing out the distinguishing qualities of a panentheistic omnipresence. One of the hallmarks of a panentheistic omnipresence is that the aim is to construct a maximally strong sense of divine immanence, in which the interrelatedness between God and world is considered as something so strong that one is justified in saying that the cosmos is within God and God is within the cosmos, not only in a metaphorical but metaphysical sense. In other words, for panentheists, it is not enough for God to pervade the world must also pervade God. This alone separates panentheism from so-called classical theism. But what about its cousin, pantheism? Gasser has this to say: however, this interrelatedness does not collapse into a pantheistic identity relation between God and the cosmos, because panentheists explicitly stress that the cosmos is not divine. Following this, he introduces Hudson's proposal to construe divine omnipresence in terms of ubiquitous extension. Ubiquitous extension. Gasser provides the following cursory definition for Hudson's ubiquitous extension: God is located at each region in space wholly and entirely at the most inclusive region, say the cosmos, and wholly at all its proper subregions. Accordingly, there is no region disjoint from the cosmos where God is located to, and within the cosmos God is present everywhere in its whole plenitude. After expanding upon this further and noting some peculiarities, Gasser breaks the theoretical ice by showing the consequences of Hudson's position, as Hudson himself professes. If we wish to adhere to the criterion of ubiquitous extension as it is proposed, we must accept that God is a material object in a literal sense. 15 Beyond the visceral reaction many monotheists have to such a position, there are various analytical problems with this view of divine omnipresence. The core problem with this interpretation is that God is unable to inherit a stable physical identity. If God is seen as physically inhabiting each and every portion of physical space, then he has no privileged shape. The impasse is this: how can one entity have myriad different physical shapes at the same time? Space as divine attribute. If one wishes to retain the basic idea of Hudson's ubiquitous extension, while easing its analytical tension, one can take space to be an attribute of God himself. In this interpretation of divine omnipresence, God is no longer contained in space. Rather, God is space in a certain metaphysical sense. Gasser has this to say about the interpretation: absolute space grounds in 15 Gasser, 2019, the way God is, not in any specific creative act, which God performs. Therefore, it is decisive to distinguish two notions of space: space as an aspect of the divine, that is absolute space, and the kind of space we are familiar with, that is physical space, which comes into existence with creation. Then he touches more on the notion of metaphysical grounding, informally construed as a relation of metaphysical explanation between entities. Whereas Hudson's ubiquitous extension entails a single relation of such explanation, that between God and the material world, space as divine attribute entails two relations, 1. That between God and absolute space, and 2. That between absolute space and physical space. In Gasser's words, absolute space serves as a receptacle for physical space because the latter comes into existence with creation. Immaterial extension in space. The space as divine attribute interpretation is not the only way to sidestep the paradoxy associated with Hudson's notion of ubiquitous extension. Instead of having God materially pervade all regions of physical space, as in Hudson's construal, we can make him immaterially pervade such space. As it turns out, such a view is far from uncommon. Ross D. Inman makes a convincing claim that Augustine and Anselm are two examples of eminent pre-modern philosophers defending the view that extended location, immateriality, and simplicity go together. 16. Additionally, Robert Pasnaw contends that the universally accepted view in medieval theology was that God exists holimerically throughout space, wholly existing at each place in the universe. 17. But what exactly does it mean to exist holimerically? This is a rather obscure term. The term holimerism arose in relation to Descartes' mind-body dualism. One of Descartes' contemporaries, a rival of philosophical opinion, Henry Moore, coined the term to refer to the former's conception of the nature of the soul. 18. This is the origin of what Gasser calls the classical example of holimeric existence, the fact that the soul informs all bodily parts and thereby provides their internal structural organization, exists as a whole in the entire body and as a whole in each bodily part too. Divine agency. This is the final interpretation of the N in panentheism given by Gasser. Just as the immaterial extension in space interpretation, that of divine agency is nothing new. The loose idea that God's omnipresence is a function of his activity in the world has been around for many hundreds of years. Gasser provides a passage from the 12th century theologian, Peter Lombard. It should be kept in mind that God, who exists immutably in himself, is in every nature or essence by presence, by power, and by essence, without his being limited, and in every place. 16. Inman, 2017, 17. Pasnaw, 2011, 18. Rosemond, 2015, without circumscription, and in every time without mutability. And furthermore he is in holy spirits and souls in a more excellent way, namely, indwelling by grace. 19. Divine agency is able to address one of the most glaring paradoxes associated with interpretations of spatial or immaterial extension. It seems that God can appear differently to different people, in differing circumstances. Gasser states the problem like so: the problem is that according to the biblical tradition and personal religious experiences, God acts differently at different places. Consider, for instance, the biblical narrative of God speaking to Moses from the burning bush. This seems to presuppose that God is manifesting himself in a singular way at a particular place and that God is simultaneously not present in this specific way at any other place. By abstracting away from the issue of divine attribute, this interpretation affords panentheists a great analytical tool. However, it is not yet clear how to express it in any rigorous fashion. The unity we have just seen, the variety of panentheism, now it is time to find the unity. A perfect way to broach the topic is to establish a rough list of concepts essential to panentheism. What makes panentheism what it is? Theologian Niels Gregerson offers a brilliantly rigorous and compact list. 1. God contains the world yet is also more than the world. Thus the world is, in some sense, in God. 2. The world is, in some sense, independent from God, or, entities in the world have some causal autonomy, or, they can be viewed in some sense as causal agents. 3. As contained in God, the world not only derives its existence from God, but also returns to God. The world is, or, will be, united with God, while yet preserving the characteristics of being created, i.e., while remaining world. Thus the relations between God and world are, in some sense, bilateral. 20. This is about as abstract and bare bones as we can get. Whatever panentheism is, its definition centers on the two-step relation between God and world, or, in the words of Gregerson, the bilateral relation between the two. And whatever distinguishes it from pantheism, the main idea is that panentheism ascribes some special divinity to God, above and beyond any divinity ascribed to the mere world. In context of the above survey of proposed meanings of the N in panentheism, each and every interpretation is necessarily centered on the bilateral relationship between God and the world. One could not so much as claim to be discussing panentheism at all if one offered a supposed definition of it without anchoring it into this two-step relation. It is here that we can come full circle and revisit some of the bare-bones definitions we provided at the beginning of surveying the field. We mentioned that the Stanford Encyclopedia 19 Lombard, 1971-1981, 20 Peacock and Clayton, 2004, of philosophy defines panentheism as that taking God and the world to be interrelated with the world being in God and God being in the world. We also mentioned that Philip Clayton defines it as the claim that the world exists within the divine, although God is also more than the world. Here too we see the two-step relation between God and the world, this mysterious and vague dual inclusion. We will now endeavor to find out more about this core aspect of panentheism. Distilling panentheism, it is no secret that the N in panentheism remains an incredibly vague concept. Despite the efforts of numerous gifted theologians and philosophers, a precise definition of God in world and world in God inclusion, not to mention the relationship between these two, has eluded us. R.T. Mullins echoes this, saying the following: what does it mean to say that the universe is in God, but God is more than the universe? Critics of panentheism, like Goke, acknowledge the difficulty with defining the in. In fact, panentheists themselves typically acknowledge that the in is a fuzzy concept and that there is no widespread agreement on its meaning. Yet, they maintain that it is still meaningful in defining panentheism. Point 21 Given this continuing fuzziness of the N, how can we ever expect to give it a precise definition? Where should we look? If we are looking for rigor and formality, an apt place to begin is at the notion of metaphysical grounding. The intuition of grounding is that of a fact or entity being as it is in virtue of another. For example, we can say that the fact that a particle is accelerating obtains in virtue of the fact that it is being acted upon by some net positive force. Point 22 Given its metaphysical, explanatory nature, grounding is often cast in the mold of modality. For instance, we can equivalently rephrase our prior example the following way: necessarily, if a particle is acted upon by some positive force, then it is accelerating. Moreover, the relation of metaphysical grounding is seen as transcending modality in the traditional sense. Kit Fine describes this property of grounding as so: it is natural in cases of grounding to say that the explanans or explanantia are constitutive of the explanandum, or that the explanandum's holding consists in nothing more than the obtaining of the explanans or explanantia. 23 Metaphysical grounding is closely related to the notion of ontological dependence. Although much fuss is made over the precise relationship between the two, for most intents and purposes, the latter can simply be seen as a weaker version of the former. Point 24 A commonly used example to demarcate grounding from dependence is something like so: although it is the case that the singleton set, Socrates depends on Socrates himself, it is not the case that the set Socrates grounds Socrates himself. Point 25-21 Mullins, 2016, 22 Fine, 2012, 23 Ibid 24 C Rydeen, 2018, for an in-depth investigation of the relationship between grounding and dependence. 25 C Rabin and Raburn, 2015, for a discussion of the technical and philosophical aspects of grounding. Additionally, there is often a proposed difference in reflexivity of the two relations. Reflexivity is simply the rule that, for all real R, it is the case that R is related to itself. According to most metaphysicians, there is nothing stopping the relation of ontological dependence from being reflexive. On the other hand, it would seem bizarre and counterintuitive to grant grounding the property of reflexivity. In other words, something needs itself to exist in order to possess the properties it does, but it seems strange to say that something grounds itself in existence in order to possess its properties. With these technicalities aside, let us see if we can apply the notions of dependence and grounding to panentheism. In our beginning section, Surveying the Field, we invoked Tom Ord's list of the various construals of the N in panentheism. In the context of the above discussion of grounding, one of these interpretations now stands out: God provides the ground for emergences in, or the emergence of, the world. This use of the term ground is proper enough, but there is something odd about the explanation as a whole. Something is missing. As we mentioned before, in George Gasser's analysis of the meanings of N, he emphasized the importance of divine omnipresence, viewing this notion as indispensable to the definition of panentheism. But Gasser did not stop there. He recognized that this divine omnipresence is not a particularly strong claim. In fact, every variety of theism, save deism, incorporates it into its respective definition. We have much the same scenario in terms of the grounding of the world. It would be absurd for a classical theist to deny God the ability to ground all real entities. Although there are attempts to lather the question in technicalities, if we adhere to the definition of a ground as a metaphysical explanation, then there can be no theist left to answer, God is not the metaphysical explanation for X, for any X whatsoever. 26 So, while it may be accurate to say that a panentheistic God provides the ground for emergences in or the emergence of the world, it is not sufficient for a rigorous, all-encompassing definition of the N in panentheism. If we wish to give panentheism a precise definition, we must heed Gasser's words when he says, the aim is to construct a maximally strong sense of divine immanence, and we must also pay attention to Gregerson, when he states that, in panentheism, the relations between God and world are, in some sense, bilateral. But where exactly do we go from here? How can we penetrate to the essence of panentheism? We contend that we must further examine the idea of divine mutability. Before we define panentheism in any rigorous fashion, we must attempt to answer the following question: how is it possible that God depends on the world and yet is not fully dependent upon it? 27 Whereas in classical theism God does not depend in any way upon the world he created, in panentheism God is said to be, at the very least, influenced by the world. 28 This feature of panentheism provides the perfect segue into the question of God's mutability. In panentheism especially, as opposed to other theisms, the question of divine mutability is an especially tricky. 26 Sometimes there is confusion between grounding within the world inside God and grounding as a well-founded chain in its entirety. When the former vantage of grounding is considered, the core issues of panentheism, those of world to God and God to world relation, can become blurred. 27 Note that in the formal sense of the word ontological dependence, the relation is often antisymmetric, meaning that if W depends on G then it cannot be that G depends on W. We will investigate this property further shortly, but for now we intend the informal meaning of dependence. 28 For more on the general problem of panentheistic creation, see Peacock and Clayton's In Whom We Live and Move and Have Our Being, 2004. 1. On one hand, God is transcendent of the world and thus possesses some degree of immutability. But on the other, God intimately relates with the mercurial world, dancing to and fro with it. In our section Surveying the Field, we touched briefly on such issues, especially in conjunction with the ubiquitous extension interpretation of the N offered by Hudson. We mentioned the paradoxy associated with it, the fact that this view leads to God being considered as a material being, and that it seems exceedingly bizarre, if not outright contradictory, for one entity to simultaneously retain numerous different shapes. Following this, we mentioned several proposed resolutions of this paradox, allowing God to be present everywhere, without having to compromise his stability. Although we gave overviews of these interpretations, explaining their core components, we did not analyze them. We will now analyze these interpretations from a very specific viewpoint. We will import the concepts of grounding and ontological dependency, keeping in mind what we have said about the limitations of divine omniscience and the shortcoming of the maxim, God grounds the world. We will bring to these interpretations the following questions: 1. How, precisely, is it that God is mutable? And, 2. What sort of dependency does God have on the world? I.e., How do changes in the world affect God, and how does he adapt to such changes? We can kick things off by making explicit some things we have previously left implicit. At base level, panentheism is a theism of two fundamental relations: world to God and God to world. From now on, we will refer to these two relations as WTG and GTW. Below is a rough definition of the two. WTG, some sort of ontological relation running from the world to God. GTW, some sort of ontological relation running from God to the world. The former relation, WTG, is rather easy to pin down. If we remember, Stenmark asserted that the first distinguishing feature of monotheism, in all its varieties, is the following: 1. God is the creator of the world, so the world depends on God for its origin. Point 29. We could also make the argument that any supposed panentheism either dismissing or heavily qualifying this world to God grounding would collapse into pantheism. Point 30. In panentheism, the WTG relation ostensibly seems to equate to God's transcendence of the world. This means that WTG can simply be taken as the relation, the world is grounded in God, or W31 Guaranese. We will take this rough conception of WTG for granted until we dig deeper into our analysis. The relation GTW is much trickier to handle. Gasser's paper on the various interpretations of the N can be seen as an investigation of the GTW relation, an attempt to see how God responds to the world. Given the richness and complexity of GTW, we will not attempt to. 29 Stenmark, 2019, 30. We are carefully skirting around some areas of tension in modern philosophy of religion. Not all pantheisms or panentheisms are created equal, but one of the, if not the, distinguishing feature, of pantheism is that it is not only the case that the world depends on God for its origin, God, being in an identity relation with the world, also depends on the world for his origin. 31. Here we assume that any given grounding chain is transitive. We do not mean to imply that WG with no intermediate groundings such that W, G provide a definition until we address each and every construal of it in Gasser's paper. To reiterate, there is the ubiquitous extension interpretation, the space as divine attribute interpretation, that of immaterial extension in space and that of divine agency. GTW in ubiquitous extension. This interpretation of panentheism's N is interesting. Although it offers a theory of divine omnipresence, it is not immediately clear if it even addresses the GTW relation in its full scope. Several paragraphs ago we put forth two crucial questions regarding the GTW relation. 1. How, precisely, is it that God is mutable? And, 2. What sort of dependency does God have on the world? I.e., how do changes in the world affect God, and how does he adapt to such changes? Unfortunately, Hudson's ubiquitous extension fails to address either of these crucial questions. Why is that so? The interpretation of ubiquitous extension is built upon the primitive notion of being present at 32. Gasser notes that, according to this interpretation, God is located at each region in space wholly and entirely at the most inclusive region, say the cosmos, just as he is located wholly at all its proper subregions. On the face of things, the GTW relation is certainly addressed. The question of how God can be near every region of the cosmos is addressed in full, and we can say that the following definition of panentheism's GTW relation is assigned: a relation of being located at from God to the inclusive cosmos, as superregion, and God to all proper subregions of the cosmos. Although Kwu answers the mereological spatial question of divine omnipresence, it neglects to consider the nature of the dependence of God upon the world. This interpretation does not say a word about how God and the regions he is located at interact or mutually evolve. GTW in space as divine attribute. This interpretation makes things a bit easier on us, as the notion of metaphysical grounding is explicitly mentioned. Space as divine attribute entails two grounding relations: 1, that between God and absolute space, and 2, that between absolute space and physical space. In Gasser's words, absolute space serves as a receptacle for physical space because the latter comes into existence with creation. Formally, we have the grounding chain, PS as G. Physical space, PS, is ontologically anchored into absolute space, as, and absolute space is anchored into God, G. Where we take PS to be equivalent to the cosmos, or world, as conceived in Hudson's ubiquitous extension interpretation, we have the following grounding chain, W as G. Finally, where we take the grounding chain to be transitive, we have WG, the fact that God grounds the world. We can say this interpretation's proposed GTW relation looks like this: Twista, a relation of metaphysical grounding from God's attribute of absolute space to the world, W as 32 Hudson, 2009. While this interpretation addresses the problem of divine omniscience in a unique and interesting way, it fails to say more than the near platitude, God grounds the world. The crucial questions we have given related to God's mutability and dependency on the world are left unaddressed. GTW in immaterial extension in space. This interpretation is extremely easily to analyze in light of recent discussion. The only difference between this and its neighbor, ubiquitous extension, is the proposed substance of God. While immaterial extension escapes the logical pitfalls of Hudson's proposal, it fails to say anything more than where God is located in the world. This interpretation uses the very same being located at relation as does Hudson's, and the proposed form of metaphysical grounding is precisely the same. Therefore we have the following relation, Theists, a relation of being located at from God to the inclusive cosmos, as superregion, and God to all proper subregions of the cosmos. In terms of God's dependency upon the world and the specifics of his mutability, this interpretation offers variation in name only. GTW in divine agency. As Gasser himself notes, this interpretation is extremely fruitful. There is a certain rigidity in those explanations of divine omniscience that merely describe where God is at and neglect the specifics of how he behaves where he is. Gasser mentions Eleanor Stump and her aim to overcome the shortcomings of mere metaphysical presence by proposing a relational personal model of God's presence in the cosmos. 33 He mentions that Stump's primary motivation is the desire to move beyond certain discontinuities in the so-called ordinary metaphysical, mereological and grounding-based accounts of the relationship between God and the world. One of the most prominent of these so-called discontinuities is something that has been termed the intensity puzzle. 34 This puzzle says that if God ubiquitously entends all locations in the cosmos, then there is not a coherent way to explicate greater concentrations of God's presence, as the experience of the faithful indicates. The term entends denotes the very same spatial relation utilized by Hudson for his ubiquitous extension interpretation. Something entends a given region R if it is present both at the location itself and at every subregion of R. This intensity puzzle cuts straight to the core of the problem of divine mutability. It is one thing for God to divide himself up and present himself to all parts of the world. We may call this a sort of weak mutability. 35 But it is another thing entirely to explain the dynamic interactions between world and God and to address how the changing of the world affects God. The divine agency interpretation makes progress towards meeting this latter condition. Even more importantly, this interpretation takes into, almost, full account the bilateral nature of the relation between God and the world. Gasser stresses as much, saying this: God is in the cosmos by creating and sustaining it, and the cosmos is in God by constantly being within the sphere of divine. 33 Gasser, 2019, 34 C. Arcudi, 2017. See also Jedwab, 2016, 148, and Gordon, 2018, 537539. 35 We will provide a precise definition of this term, and strong mutability, shortly. Activity. Whereas the other interpretations Gasser discussed were solely focused on the capacity of divine omnipresence, at the neglect of the GTW portion of the panentheistic dual relation, divine agency addresses the world's receptivity to God. This is an extremely important step along the way to fully defining panentheism. Let us now define this view's conception of GTW relation, a two-part relation consisting of 1. A relation of acting upon from God to the inclusive cosmos, as superregion, and to all proper subregions of the cosmos, and 2. A relation of being acted upon from the world, in all subregions and the inclusive whole, to God. Just by the definition alone, we can tell that this interpretation is richer and more nuanced than the other proposals. But to provide an even more concrete appraisal of the approach, we can expand upon the notions of weak mutability, WM, and strong mutability, SM, we recently mentioned. Let us give the definitions. WM, an account of divine mutability which attempts to explain how God can present himself to different regions of the world, i.e., how God can duplicate his transcendent self. SM, an account of divine mutability which attempts to explain how the regions of the world interact with God and how he retains his transcendence despite this, i.e., how God retains his structure despite being in the world. 36 Weak mutability is lacks enough of an explanation so as to be used by any theism that desires to account for divine omnipresence. And WM is an explanation that accounts solely for divine omnipresence, nothing more and nothing less. 3 out of the 4 interpretations explored by Gasser rely solely upon WM. The divine agency proposal, however, is sophisticated enough to transcend it, although it does not quite hit the bull's-eye that is SM. We contend that it achieves something we can best call partial mutability, PM, an account of divine mutability which attempts to explain both, 1. How God behaves at the regions he is present at, and 2. How the world receives God. It might not be immediately apparent how PM differs from SM. Is it not the case that both of these forms of explanation address both world to God and God to world relation? Indeed, it certainly is the case that PM accounts for both sides of the dual relation essential to panentheism. But while both of these types of explanation account for the duality of relation, the stronger variety not only does this but addresses the dynamic question of how the world interacts with God. Moreover, SM accounts for any accompanying changes to God, after he is confronted by the world. What PM does is simply describe a dual capacity. PM provides a merely static representation of how God and the world link together. So now the million-dollar question is this: how can we build upon the fruitful interpretation that is divine agency, helping it to achieve a strongly mutable explanation? Our answer 36. There is a treasure trove of scholarship addressing various varieties of mutability and their implications. But unfortunately it is beyond the scope of this work to delve into it. Category theory. We will use this brilliant tool to rigorously define panentheism, as it is one of the best suited formalisms to the modeling of dynamic process. But before we dive in headfirst, we will give a brief introduction to the sometimes daunting subject of category theory. 37 Rest assured, however, that the fundamentals themselves are nothing too intimidating. A category theory primer. The vocabulary used in category theory can be intimidating and rather obscure sounding. There is talk of morphisms, functors and Hom sets, none of which has a distinctive counterpart outside of category theory itself. But, at the base level, category theory is extremely simple. There are objects, and there are arrows between these objects. Unnamed objects are represented as dots, and arrows are simply arrows. Mathematically speaking, a rough way to view objects and arrows is to see the former as generalizations of sets and the latter as generalizations of functions between sets. 38 A commonly used definition of the arrow symbol in category theory is a structure-preserving mapping. This is a fancy way of saying that whatever internal, logical, properties the objects have, the mapping between them leaves unsullied whatever properties the mathematician has singled out as important. Another common mathematical saying is that a given mapping, etc., is well behaved. While objects and arrows are the building blocks of category theory, they do not tell the whole story. The hallmark of category theory is a certain condition placed upon these objects and arrows, a constraint that the given collection of objects and arrows, called a diagram, commutes. Although the notion of diagram commutativity can become rather dizzying in diagrams with abundant morphisms and objects, it is based on one simple concept: the composition of arrows. Composition is defined as composition of arrows. Given any two arrows f and g, there is an operation of composition that forms an arrow, or set of arrows, h, such that h, x, equals g, f, x. For example, given an arrow f, x, y and another g, y, z, the composition g, f gives a third arrow h that takes members of x to members of z, h, x, z. 37. Before we commence our discussion, we should mention the rich history of implementing category theory in metaphysics and philosophy in general. Categories for the Working Philosopher, 2017, serves as a brilliant survey of the interface between category theory and philosophy. Another great anthology is Category Theory in Physics, Mathematics, and Philosophy, 2019, in which the article The Application of Category Theory to Epistemic and Poetic Processes by Joseph Lubitsch highlights the metaphysical uses of categories. From a more continental point of view, there is the book Diagrammatic Immanence, Category Theory and Philosophy, 2016, by Rocco Gangle. Although we propose to acquaint category theory with philosophy of religion, we must maintain that to do so is nothing astoundingly original. 38. Goldblatt, 2006, using the arrow composition operation, we can build up from simple chains of objects and arrows to more complex shapes of interconnections like so. Now on to the notion of diagram commutativity. Given the operation of composition, we will not need to lay out the rigorous, axiomatic definition of what it means to commute. For our purposes, the following informal definition will work just fine. Diagram commutativity: a diagram of objects and arrows commutes if for every two arrows f and g there is a composition arrow, or set thereof, h, and if for every object x there is at least one arrow going to it or from it. The intuition behind a diagram commuting is that of a shape being fully completed. And, commonly, commutative diagrams are composed of solely various combinations of triangles and squares as shown above. 39. Armed with arrow composition and diagram commutativity, we are almost ready to unveil a category theoretic definition of panentheism. But, for where we are headed, we will need one more tool. We will need to learn how to use the category theoretic notion of a subobject. The subobject is the notion of a set theoretic subset abstracted into category theoretic terms. In order to see what a subobject is, we first have to define a particular type of arrow. As it so happens, not all arrows are created equal. There are various conditions that can be placed upon arrows, changing the way they interact with their surroundings. One condition we can place on an arrow is that no two distinct input arrows into its domain, the object from which it points, can yield the result of its range, the landing point within the object to which it points. This condition is called injectivity, and the arrow that adheres to it is called a monic arrow. To get a better intuition of this condition, we can illustrate the basic idea like so. 39. The reader might have noticed that we have not yet given a definition for a category, despite all the talk about diagrams. This is because, for our uses, the notion of a category needs only to be an overarching concept, as opposed to an axiomatic definition. Diagrams are simply little pieces of the category they belong to. One intuitive way to informally define a category is as a universe of mathematical discourse, considering that such a universe is determined by specifying a certain kind of object and a certain kind of function between objects. See Goldblatt's Topoi, The Categorial Analysis of Logic, 2006, for this explanation. Here f is the monic arrow and g and h are any two arrows mapping into f's domain object. The condition of injectivity says that g and h must be the same arrow. In other words, if there is a monic arrow between two objects, there is only one unique way for any other object to map into it. Now that we have introduced the monic arrow, we can introduce the notion of a subobject. We mentioned that a subobject is a category theoretic counterpart to the notion of a subset. But what is the connection between the two? the relation is actually quite straightforward. Just as a subset Y of a set X can either be a subset YX, where Y and X have an equal number of elements, or a proper subset YX, where Y has less elements than X, any given monic arrow F can map to a portion of its codomain with an equal number of elements to its domain or to a portion of it with less elements. Although this ability might not seem very special, the monic arrow is the only type of arrow which allows such things. The other common type of arrow, the epic arrow, is an arrow F, X, Y that adheres to the condition that the codomain Y is equal to the range of F, i.e., for every element EY in Y there is a corresponding element X in X such that F, X, equals EY. This epic arrow is simply a category-theoretic counterpart of a surjective function. And although it is useful for many constructions, it does not allow a notion of proper inclusion, where YX, Y is smaller than X. Now we can define a subobject. Subobject, an object Y is a subobject of another object X is a monic arrow F, X, Y. And we can also define the notion of a category-theoretic power set of subobjects, if a given object C is a set, as opposed to an object with extra mathematical structure, then there exists a collection of all subsets of C, P, C. Given this power set of C, we can then form a partially ordered set, i.e., the power set P, C, equipped with the relation of inclusion, P, C. This partially ordered set then becomes a collection of diagrams that look like the following. The little curl at the end of the arrow simply denotes that its domain is included in its codomain, and it is for this reason often called the inclusion arrow. With our discussion of subobjects complete, we are now ready to move to the fun part. Let us see if we can define panentheism. A category-theoretic definition of panentheism. Let us do a quick recap before we dive in. We contend that panentheism comprises two fundamental relations, one running from world to God, WTG, and another running from God to world, GTW. We have said that the former relation is easier to handle, and it is often adequate to define it as a metaphysical grounding relation. The world is grounded by God, or WG. The GTW relation is much trickier to handle, and various proposals have construed it quite differently. We surveyed these proposals and found the one which emphasizes divine agency to be the richest. This proposal offers the following GTW relation, a two-part relation consisting of, 1. A relation of acting upon from God to the inclusive cosmos, as superregion, and to all proper subregions of the cosmos, and, 2. A relation of being acted upon from the world, in all subregions and the inclusive whole, to God. But while this approach to the GTW relation represents an improvement over those offered by other proposals, it does not fully address the complexities of a panentheistic God. The divine agency interpretation provides a compelling account of the omnipresence of God, but it does not fully explain how exactly the world interacts with God. It does nothing to explain the nitty-gritty details of God's mutability and transcendency and how these properties come to bear on the objects of the world. Regarding this, we offered a standard of clarity to which to aspire, if we are to define panentheism in any rigorous sense. We called this criterion of explanation strong mutability, SM, an account of divine mutability which attempts to explain how the regions of the world interact with God and how he retains his transcendence despite this, i.e., how God retains his structure despite being in the world. With this being said, let us now define panentheism according to the general direction suggested by divine agency and the criterion of clarity SM. We will start by drawing an intuitive diagram, something that represents a crucial concept for panentheism. The intuitive notion is that any two objects in the world, X and Y, are included in God. So, on the world to God, WTG, side of things, not only do we have the fact that God grounds the world, WG, but we also have the fact that the world is included in God, WG. But what about the metaphysical grounding relation itself then? What happens to it once we view things through a category-theoretic lens? A while back we mentioned that category-theoretic objects can have internal, logical, properties. In other words, objects are not just monolithic slabs, devoid of structure. We can insert relations inside the objects themselves, knowing that the arrows, as structure-preserving maps, will not impair these internal properties. Therefore, it is only commonsensical that we insert a grounding relation into each object. Thus, in the diagram above, object X has a chain, X, G, of metaphysical grounding. Additionally, object Y has the very same chain, just as God himself has that grounding chain as part of his internal structure. Thus, in the category theoretic approach to panentheism, the WTG relation comprises two halves, one, that of inclusion of the world in God, WG, and, two, that of grounding of the world by God, WG. So how do we address the GTW relation category theoretically? In the same vein as we introduced our interpretation of the WTG relation, we can start with an intuitive diagram. This represents the notion that God's omnipresence is in virtue of his action upon all objects. Phrased differently, God is a dynamic agent who presents himself to all things. For coherency's sake, we maintain that each object being acted upon through inclusion morphism, including God himself, has an internal grounding chain, X, G. Moreover, an extremely important part of the above diagram is the fact that, because the inclusion arrows are monic, God can either present himself fully or he can restrict himself to a subset of his overall structure. Thus, this definition of the GTW relation rigorously resolves the intensity puzzle mentioned by Gasser. 40. Let us now put together the two halves of panentheism, uniting WTG and GTW. We will use one more intuitive diagram, 40 Arcadi, 2017. See also Jedwab, 2016, 148, and Gordon, 2018, 537539. From this, we are reminded that as God acts in the world is included within him. But there is an even deeper level of interaction occurring here. We can say that God can act in the world in virtue of the world being included in him, and that the world is included in him in virtue of God acting in it. Realizing that there is this sort of dependency in play, we can further elaborate on our above diagram, further uniting WTG and GTW. We will show 4 different diagrams, each one representing a necessary relationship between a panentheistic God and his world. The notation X and Y represents a category theoretic counterpart to the intersection of sets, i.e., XY. And the notation X times Y represents a counterpart to the union of sets, XY. Since God acts everywhere in the world, it is a necessary consequence that God acts at every union and every intersection of objects in the world. This much is nothing earth-shattering. The interesting thing about the above diagrams is that we see the full flow from God to world and world to God. In order for the panentheistic process to continue on, this flow of arrows from God to world, and vice versa, cannot be broken. Roughly put, God retains his structure in a mutable world by flowing through objects, i.e., from acting upon all X and Y and, in turn, including all X and Y. We mentioned above a type of mutual dependency. We said that God can act in the world in virtue of the world being included in him and that the world is included in him in virtue of God acting. If we remember our discussion on the various relations of ontological dependency, this in virtue of should draw a parallel with the notion of metaphysical grounding. In our section, Distilling Panentheism, we utilized one of Kit Fine's intuitive examples of grounding. We can say that the fact that a particle is accelerating obtains in virtue of the fact that it is being acted upon by some net positive force. 41. So, at first glance, it seems that God's action in the world grounds the world's inclusion in him. But this is not exactly true, at least, not conventionally speaking. Several paragraphs ago we mentioned that a category theoretic panentheism places the metaphysical grounding chain itself inside each and every object of the world, including God himself. Moreover, the sort of grounding that we see between inclusion arrows like WG and GW possesses some peculiar attributes. 42 The sort of grounding does not adhere to the conventionally held conditions of grounding: irreflexivity, XX, transitivity, if XY and YZ, then XZ, and asymmetry, XY and YX. 43 In fact, this sort of grounding violates each one of these conditions. Nonetheless, the dependency between God's action in the world and the world's inclusion in him stands logically firm. One cannot help but wonder if this peculiarity has not been the main impediment to a precise definition of panentheism. We will now briefly explain why this new breed of grounding, what we shall call morphic grounding or MG, violates the above conditions for grounding as conventionally conceived. Irreflexivity. Start by considering the following string of objects and arrows. This illustrates the intuition that everything upon which God acts must be included within him. But, if we remember the nature of a so-called commutative diagram, this string of objects and arrows is incomplete. Although it is a perfectly valid construction for purposes of panentheism, it does not commute. To make it commute, we can add an arrow from X to itself to make a commuting diagram. Thus our string becomes, and this translates into the following commutative diagram, with both acting arrows and including arrows to show the bilateral nature. 41 Fine, 2012. 42 We take grounding to be any inclusion arrow from any object to any other object. Thus, even a self-mapping, XX is taken to constitute an instance of what we will call morphic grounding. 43 See Rabin and Ravern, 2015, for a technical discussion. The more we reason about this diagram, the more we see how it is permissible. If we wish to illustrate two different ways God acts upon the object X, we must show how the object X itself connects with both of God's actions. 44 In this sense, XX is an intuitive representation of the stability of objects through space and or time. Thus, morphic grounding, MG, violates irreflexivity. Transitivity. Suppose we have the following two strings of objects and arrows. Is it necessarily the case that we have XZ? No, it is not necessarily the case. If X is an object of the world, then it is necessarily the case that X God, just as if Z is an object of the world, then it must be the case that God Z. However, these two arrows tell us nothing about the comparative sizes of X and Z. It could just as easily be the case that ZX instead of XZ. Thus, morphic grounding, MG, violates transitivity. Asymmetry. 44 Where we allow various different mappings from between two of the same objects, we alter the technical details a bit. In this case, the partially ordered set of subobject inclusion, P, C, is no longer a set but a multiset, a collection which permits repeating subsets. We will talk about this more shortly. That MG lacks this condition is easy to prove. We have said that for any X, it is the case that X God, X is included in God. And, we have also said that it must also be the case that God X, God acts upon X. Thus, MG violates asymmetry. It should be clear that morphic grounding is a novel form of grounding. And it could very well be the case that one of the barriers to a precise definition of panentheism has been the entrenched bias against grounding relations which fail to adhere to the usual conditions. 45 We now approach the end of the journey. But before we end things, we will do two things. 1. We will reiterate our developments and provide an axiomatic definition of panentheism, and, 2. We will view our definition in terms of our criterion of clarity, strong mutability, SM. A rigorously defined panentheism. We contend that whatever specifics a given panentheism possesses, it must at least have the following logical structure: a collection C of objects with God as a distinguished element and a collection A of inclusion arrows between them, such that the category of panentheism Pn is the fusion of a partially ordered multiset, P, God, Inc., of all subobjects of God and another partially ordered multiset, P, God, Act, of all subobjects of God. 46 Whereas in P, God, Inc., the notion of containment of an object by another moves from left to right, i.e., x God means that x is contained within God. In p. God, act, the notion of containment moves from right to left, i.e., God x means that x is actively contained within God. 47 Internal to each object of C, including God himself, is the given grounding chain of the world, x, g. For every object of C it is the case that God. For every object of C it is the case that God. The usual requirements of composition and commutativity. 45 No doubt, there has been much discussion of metaphysical grounding which violates any number of the three usual conditions. It is not clear, however, that unique forms of grounding have sufficiently worked their way into philosophy of religion. 46 A multiset is simply a collection of objects in which repeating elements are permitted. Several pages ago, we gave an example where we considered two distinct arrows from the same object x to God. Permitting different arrows from like objects allows for a more detailed approach. For more on the concept of multisets, see Monroe, G.P., 1987. The concept of multiset. Mathematical logic quarterly. 47 There is a subtle but hugely important difference between 1. God x translating to x is actively contained within God, and 2. God x translating to God is contained within x. God himself, as a transcendent being, is not literally contained within any object. Rather, God sends a version of himself to interact with objects. We assert that whatever else is appended to panentheism can only bring variety, as opposed to more rigorous definition. Fulfillment of SM. We introduced a condition of explanation called strong mutability, asserting that a rigorous definition of panentheism must adhere to it. SM, an account of divine mutability which attempts to explain how the regions of the world interact with God and how he retains his transcendence despite this, i.e., how God retains his structure despite being in the world. We contend that our category-theoretic definition of panentheism meets SM satisfactorily. Our definition says that God's structure is threefold. Within God, there is a metaphysical grounding chain, x, g. We take this chain to adhere to the conventional rules of grounding, irreflexivity, transitivity, and asymmetry. This classical grounding chain is the first component of God's structure. The second component is God's inclusion in the world, God W. And the third component of his structure is the world's inclusion in him, W God. Considering this threefold structure of God makes addressing the last clause of SM rather simple. In answer as to how God retains his structure despite being in the world, we can assert that God self retains his structure. How is this so? Consider the fact that a panentheistic God, in grounding the world, presents himself to all parts of the world and contains all objects of the world. Moreover, in order for God to present himself to the world must be contained within him. And, in order for the world to be contained within him, God must present himself to it. The innate bilaterality of panentheism emphasized by Gregerson is finally given a rigorous representation. 48 Given this, we can say that God retains his structure because of his dynamic relationship with not only the world but with himself as well. In other words, God retains his structure through use of his structure. 49 Consequently, God's mutability is necessarily subject to his overall structure and thus no threat to his transcendence. 48 Peacock and Clayton, 2004, 49 We see a similar emphasis on the self-maintenance of God in Langen, 2018. In fact, Langen goes even further into the technical details, contending that God is fundamentally self-dual. Self-duality as a mathematical notion is an elaboration on duality. A basic example of duality can be found in predicate logic. The existential quantifier is the dual of the universal quantifier by definition. Although duality is construed differently across various contexts, the basic idea is that two dual objects stand in some sort of relation to one another, such that they can be transposed and still stand as well-behaving mathematical objects. A self-dual object has the power to dualize itself. The dualization of it is isomorphic to its original structure. Conclusion: we surveyed the various construals of panentheism and settled on the notion of divine agency, as explicated by George Gasser, as an especially crucial idea for its definition. We then unveiled a mathematical tool well suited to issues of agency, dynamic interaction, and action: category theory. Although numerous theologians and philosophers of religion have provided cogent, even attractive, definitions of panentheism, we contend that our approach attains a certain precision that has not yet been achieved. We hope that our approach proves helpful, and we are certain that much more is to be said about panentheism and its beautiful subtleties. References: Arcadi, J.M., 2017. God is where God acts, Reconceiving Divine Omnipresence. Topoi, 36, 4, 631639. Clayton, p. 2017. How radically can God be reconceived before ceasing to be God? The Four Faces of Panentheism. Zygone, 52, 4, 10441059. https://doi.org/10.1111/zygo.12368. Crisp, O.D., 2019. Against Mereological Panentheism. European Journal for Philosophy of Religion 11, 223-41. Fine, K. 2012. Guide to Ground. Metaphysical Grounding, 3780. Cambridge University Press. doi 10.1017/CB09781139149136.002. Gangle, R. 2016. Diagrammatic Immanence, Category Theory and Philosophy. Edinburgh University Press. Gasser, G. 2019. God's Omnipresence in the World, on Possible Meanings of N in Panentheism. International Journal for Philosophy of Religion 85, 4362. Goldblatt, R. 2006. Topoi, The Categorical Analysis of Logic. Dover Publications. Gordon, J.R., 2018. Rethinking Divine Spatiality, Divine Omnipresence in Philosophical and Theological Perspective. The Heythrop Journal, 59, 3, 534543. https://doi.org/10.1111/Hage.12832. Hudson, H. 2009. Omnipresence. In T. P. Flint and M. C. Rea, eds, The Oxford Handbook of Philosophical Theology, pages 199216. Oxford, Oxford University Press. Inman, R.D., 2017. Omnipresence and the Location of the Immaterial. In J. Elk Vanvig, ed., Oxford Studies in Philosophy of Religion 8, pages 168206. Oxford, Oxford University Press. Jedwab, J. 2016. God's Omnipresence, A Defense of the Classical View. European Journal for Philosophy of Religion, 8, 2, 129149. https://doi.org/10.24204/edgepair.v8i2.61. Landry, E. 2017. Categories for the Working Philosopher. Oxford, Oxford University Press. Langan, C.M., 2018. The Metaformal System, Completing the Theory of Language. Cosmos and History 14, 207-227. Langan, C.M., 2020. Introduction to the CTMU. Chris Langan's Major Papers, 1989-2020, pages 21-30. Mega Foundation Press. Laudister, R. and Billy Moria, p. 2018. Panentheism, S. What It Is and Is Not. Journal of World Philosophies, 3, 2, 49-64. Lubitsch, J. 2019. The Application of Category Theory to Epistemic and Poetic Processes. Category Theory in Physics, Mathematics, and Philosophy, pages 43 to 53. Springer, Cham. Monroe, G.P., 1987. The Concept of Multiset. Mathematical Logic Quarterly 33, 8. 171 to 178 https://doi.org/10.1002/malc.198703302212. Mullins, R.T., 2016. The Difficulty with Demarcating Panentheism. Sophia 55:32546. Pasna, R., 2011. On Existing All at Once. In C. Tap and E. Rungaldier, eds, God, Eternity, and Time, pages 1129. Farnham, Ashgate. Peacock, A. and Clayton, P. 2004. In Whom We Live and Move and Have Our Being, Panentheistic Reflections on God's Presence in a Scientific World. William B. Eerdmans Publishing. Rabin, G. O. and Raburn, B. 2015. Well-Founding Grounding. Journal of Philosophical Logic 45, 4, 349 to 379. https://doi.org/10.1007/S10992-015-9376-4. Rodigiero, R., 2019. Hunke Panentheism. Sophia 58, 581596. Rosemond, M., 2015. Hohenmierism, Hohenmarianism. The Cambridge Descartes Lexicon, pages 366 to 368. Cambridge University Press. Rydeen, H., 2018. Grounding and Ontological Dependence. Synthese. https://doi.org/10.1007/S11229-018-1818-4 Stenmark, M., 2019. Panentheism and Its Neighbors. International Journal for Philosophy of Religion 85:2341. Stump, E., 2013. Omnipresence, Indwelling, and the Second Personal. European Journal for Philosophy of Religion 5, 4, 2953. https://doi.org/10.24204/edgepair.v5i4.204. Walker Jr., T. and Wickramasinghe, C. 2015. The Big Bang and God in Astrotheology. Palgrave Macmillan, New York. View publication stats.